The Transaction Analysis and Optional Field Creator is a module that supplements the core Sage ERP Accpac accounting system. It enables you to attach additional fields of information to master records and to transaction headers and detail lines. Others use these fields to house data that may be required when customizing Accpac. In this tutorial, we'll focus on how to set up optional fields and how to attach them to master records and transactions. So let's jump right in and get started. We'll begin with the setup of optional fields. Here we have the Sage ERP Accpac portal, and to access optional field setup, we'll go to Tasks, Common Services, Optional Fields. The Sample Company Inc. database that we're using for this tutorial has several optional fields already created, and we'll look at them in a moment. But let's first create a new one for this demo. The field we'll create is intended for inventory item master files and will allow us to record the general geographic location from which an item was sourced. To add the field, we'll first enter the new field name, which will be Source, and for the description, the geographic source of this product. Next, we'll choose the type of field, and here you can see that we have a number of options. Depending on your selection here, the rest of the form will change accordingly. For example, for the data type text, we can specify the maximum number of characters that the field will allow. We'll enter 15 for our example. Moving on, you can choose to validate the field or not. If you enable validation, then you'll need to create the selections that the user must choose from. Further, you can allow blanks as a choice if you wish. We'll enable validation, and we won't allow blanks. Since our field will be validated, we'll now enter the selections that our users will choose from, and these will be local, domestic, and international. So we'll click in the value column and enter local, and the same for the description, then domestic, and finally, international. Now we'll click Add, and note that once you've added a validated field, you can't later disable the validation. Now let's review the other field types that can be used, and to do this, we'll open the Finder and look at some of the optional fields that have already been created in our Sample Company Inc. database. An example of an amount field would be last raise. Note that amount type fields default to 3 decimals. Now let's look at a number type field, and we have one called quantity. Note that for number fields, you can set the decimals from 0 to 9. An example integer field would be due date grace period. Note that it does not allow decimals, accepts up to 10 digits, and cannot exceed the value shown on the screen. And for an example yes/no field, we have credit warning. And you can see that there's no additional info to enter. And lastly, we'll look at approval, which is a date field. The entry format is month, day, year. There's also a field type for time, but an example has not been set up in the sample database to show. Now that you've seen how to create an optional field, let's now take a look at how they can be used. As mentioned earlier, optional fields can be attached to master records and to transaction headers and detail lines. For each subledger where you'd like to use optional fields, you'll need to go into the module setup and enable the specific field and identify where it will be used within the subledger. For this example, we'll enable our newly created optional field for source to be used on the inventory items master files. To do this, we'll go to Tasks, open the Setup tab, select Inventory Control, then Optional Fields. Opening the Optional Fields for selection list, here is where you identify where you want the optional field to apply. Note that this list will be different for each specific submodule. In this case, we want it to be used on item master files, so we'll select Items. Here you can see that the item's master file already has several optional fields associated with it. Now let's add the new optional field we just created called Source. To do this, we can place our cursor anywhere inside the grid and press the Insert key to add a new line. Here we'll type in our field name, Source. Now let's look at the options here. If you want a default value to be automatically inserted in the new record or transaction, you would enter it in the default value field. Notice that when we click in the field, the value set field automatically updates from no to yes. Let's open the Finder here, and you can see our selection choices, and we'll choose Domestic as our default value. The next field, Required, allows you to dictate whether it's mandatory for a user to complete this field before saving the record. If Required is set to yes, a default entry satisfies this mandatory requirement. We'll leave this set to no. The final setting here is Auto Insert. Choose Yes if you want the optional field to appear in new records and transactions. If you choose No, you can still insert it manually. In order to understand the auto insert behavior, we'll need to look at an item record. Before we do this, let's enlarge our window and click Save. And note in your memory that all of the optional fields here have auto insert set to Yes except Volume and Source. So let's close the window, and now we'll open an item master record by going to Tasks, Inventory Control, Items. To create a new item record, we'll enter XXX as the item number, and now let's open the Optional Fields tab. Notice that all of the optional fields appear here except Volume and Source, whose auto insert was set to No. As we mentioned, you can still add them manually here, which we can do by placing our cursor in the grid and hitting Insert and typing in Source, or we could use the Finder. If you want Volume and Source to appear on this tab automatically, then you just need to return to the Setup form and change Auto Insert to Yes on these fields. The Optional Fields feature also gives you the option to pass values to the general ledger. Importantly, this only works for transactions. Let's take a look at how this is set up by going to Tasks, Setup, and this time we'll look at Accounts Receivable and Optional Fields. As we mentioned, this only applies to transactions, so we'll select Invoice Details. Notice the Settings button. Here you can select the account groups for which you want to pass values to the general ledger when you post transactions that include the optional field. Note that for this to work, the optional fields used in a transaction must match those used for the applicable accounts in the general ledger. Importantly, if you choose to send optional field information to the GL, you should do so judiciously. Cluttering a GL with superfluous information can cause it to become unwieldy and slow. So now let's walk through how to enter an optional field on an invoice in Accounts Receivable. To do this, we'll go to Tasks, Accounts Receivable, Invoice Batch List. Here we'll click New to open the AR invoice entry screen. We'll enter customer number 1200, and we want to use Items, which it has defaulted to, and now we'll drop down to the item grid. Let's open the Finder and select the first item, a swivel mounting bracket. Now we'll scroll over to Optional Fields and click to open the form. On the Color field, we'll open the Finder and we'll reposition it and select Black, and now we'll close the window. And this is an example of entering an optional field at the detail level on a transaction. We can also add an optional field to the header of this invoice by opening the Optional Fields tab. And to demonstrate, under the Courier field, we'll enter UPS. And that's how you enter optional fields on transaction headers. And that completes our tutorial. Give us a call if you need assistance with this or any other feature in your Sage ERP Accpac system. Well, that's it for this tutorial. Bye for now.